I'll now introduce my genealogist in training. She has been working since last reunion when she did a presentation on Violet that everybody said was wonderful. She's been working for a year now doing deep research on another kid of Joseph named Marinda or Marindy.
Well, as my dad said, we started 2 years ago with a Joseph Roberts Heritage Series where we were going to each reunion focus on one of Joseph Roberts' children. 2 years ago, who was it? Does anyone remember? It was John Harrison Roberts, and he was in the Mine Lick Gang, and he was murdered down here on the creek after the Civil War. Do you guys remember John Harrison Roberts? Shake your head like that. That'll make me feel good if you remember. And then last year, because Miss Glenna asked me if we could focus on her ancestor, we did Miss Violet Roberts. And she had the reputation of being a tough old bird. And she took every penny that she had gotten from her husband's Civil War pension application, and she sunk it into land, and she was quite a woman. And we were lucky with Violet because we had a lot of documentation with her through land deeds and such like that. This year we are doing Marinda, who is called Mandy in two of her daughter's death certificates. So I'm going to just refer to her as Mandy from now on. And we're not as lucky with Mandy as we were with Violet because there is no land documentation where Mandy owned any land. So I'm going to give you a brief, very short presentation on what I learned. My method was, and that's what this table is over here if you guys want to look at it later on, is first off, I went through all of the census records. And in the census records, you can find out that Mandy was born down here in Mine Lick Creek like her brothers and sisters. She was the 6th child of Joseph and Rachel, and she lived down there until she was married. And then you learn from the census records that she married William Browder Lee, and they first lived down there on the creek bottom, and I'll talk to you a little bit later on where they migrated to. So the census records is very helpful for learning that type of information. The other part that I learned a lot from is land deeds. Now, even though Mandy did not own any land, her husband did. So we can learn where William Browder Lee lived and where her children lived. And also the census records, the census taker went neighbor to neighbor. So you can learn, okay, William Browder Lee and his wife were right here in this location, and they were next door to her child. And you can learn where people live. And so the deed records was also very useful in learning where people were in her family. The other thing that was useful was William Browder Lee, her husband, goes to the Civil War. And through that, he puts in a Civil War application. Civil War application and affidavits are chock full of good information on learning about your family. So this was also useful. We also, if you go into the digitized records, you can find newspaper clippings of where her family migrated and wrote back to this area. So you learn what they were concerned with, where they were living, why they moved sometimes, and that was useful. And then finally, for this family, we have quite the unique situation in that we have Latter-day Saint LDS information on this family. And I'm going to get into that as well. Okay? So as I said, Mandy was born in 1826 down on the creek. She's living with her father, her older siblings until they get married. Some of the younger siblings are born. So she's down there. She's happy. Life is good. She falls in love with William Browder Lee. Now, if you don't know, the Robertses and Lees are very much intertwined because Richard Lee, who is like the Lees' Joseph Roberts, Richard Lee came into this area, and all of the Lees have descended from him in this area. And from Richard Lee, his son William Browder Lee marries Mandy, Joseph Roberts' daughter. His son Benjamin Lee marries Sarah Roberts, Joseph's oldest daughter. His daughter Elizabeth Lee marries son William Roberts. And his grandson John Wesley Lee marries Violet Roberts. So the Lees and Robertses, from a very, maybe because they were living near each other on the creek, they were very much intermarried. And so you probably have a lot of Lee knowledge because we have been very much intertwined families. So at age 17, she marries William Browder Lee, and they live down there in the creek. And in the 1850 census, she's down there living on Minelet Creek. We say that because her neighbors are Henry Roberts, John Harrison Roberts, William and Melissa Cronk, Lindsay and Elizabeth Vickers, and Thomas Odom. All people that were down there on the creek. Now, speaking of creeks, and I'm going to talk about, like my dad talking about jumping a creek, I think that Joseph Roberts, when his kids got married, he offered them some of his land, because every time one of his children gets married, they are down on the census and it's in order of which they get married. So it kind of makes sense. I'm going to jump a little creek on that to say that that's where Mandy and William Browder Lee were at. When in the 1860 census, they move into District 13, Putnam County, and they are renting. They don't own land then. And they have 7 children at that point in time, and their post office is Pekin. And so their neighbors at that time are Lilla McGuffey, Joseph Denton Roberts, J.W. Smellage. You guys know the Smellage Cemetery, right? And that's all in that area over there, if I can point to that direction. I'm just going to say it down there, like near, I'm kind of going that way. My dad's laughing because I'm not the best person as far as math, but I have driven this area. I know where it's at. And if you know where the Joseph Denton Cemetery is, you know where his land was at. It's down there off of Old Baxter Road. I'm going to leave it at that, and you can laugh at it if you want. And then they have 2 more daughters. I'm not going to list, well, I'll go ahead and say that at that point in time, they have 2 more daughters, and then the Civil War starts happening. Now, everyone here knows from when we studied the other John Harris and Violet, Civil War was rough for everybody. And I will say that Mandy, she gets a little bit of a better situation with the Civil War. And the reason I say that is her husband doesn't go into the Civil War right away. So he stays here longer than her sister's husbands. And then also, her husband survived the Civil War. Unlike, Melissa's husband, who dies en route to mustering in, or signing up and mustering in. And some of her she lost her nephews, she lost a brother. So Mandy did lose family members, but her husband did survive. Her oldest son, Harmon Young Lee, he does not go into the war at all. So she has her oldest son there to help her out. And so in my opinion, Mandy had a little bit better than the sisters who lost their husbands, or whose husbands were so injured or had illnesses that when they came back, they died right away. So we learn a lot that William Browder Lee did come back from the war, and he had illnesses, sicknesses, things like that. They typically had the piles, just different things that they had. He comes back and he has issues. So he does put in for a pension application for being pension for getting a Civil War pension, and he does get a Civil War pension. So they get into their life and everything at that point. Yes, the Civil War was rough, but they have their children. They have their, at that point in time, they get land. We have a deed where William Browder Lee owns 100 acres. You guys may remember this from last year when we had Violet Roberts, where we showed some of the Roberts early land. This is not all the land, but this is the Roberts early land. And you see that we had in here Melissa Cronk, we had Violet, we had Henry Roberts, William Roberts, John Harrison Roberts, Joseph Roberts. And we are able to, we have identified that the William Browder Lee and Mandy's land was right about here. That's a scientific method there. Okay? And so you can come take a look, and I can point it out to you even more closely, because my mom and my dad have walked by the daffodils that were what we think was on the homestead there. So they have 100 acres of land, and life seems to be good. And then what happens is what I call not the golden years. They have some children that pass away. They have, and they have a situation that comes in their family that probably was unexpected for Mandy. Her husband is converted to LDS by 2 Mormon missionaries. We have the records. But first, his granddaughter and Harmon Young Lee, they get converted. They get him to listen to him, and he is converted, William Browder Lee. And William Browder Lee decides then to leave his family and go out to Utah. And that happened approximately 1890. He leaves his family. Now, I'm going to say this, and I don't mean to offend anyone if this makes you feel bad, but I'm going to say he abandoned his family. And the reason that I say that he abandoned his family is because he left his family here, and we know from the LDS records and from his pension application records that when he gets out there and he asks for an increase in his pension application, on the form they say, who are you married to? Have you been divorced? And who are your living children? And he puts, never been married, never been divorced, and I have no children. And so we have that. Now, I don't know what was the conversation between him and Mandy. I think that she lived on that 100 acres, and he lived out in Utah. He was picked for the southeastern or the southern mission area. So there are records of him coming back to this area, not necessarily with the mission area, but with him coming back to sell lands and things like that. But that must have been a blow for Mandy. And the rest of the family did not convert. And the reason we know that is her 2 daughters are involved with the Boma Baptist Church. We have that in the Boma Baptist Church records. Her son-in-law was the actual minister and elder in the early 1900s there. So we know that they were in the Baptist area. Her son, John Lewis Lee, he sold the land for the First Church of Christ up in Baxter. He sold the land for and was an elder in that church. So he's Church of Christ. He's not LDS. And so everything that we see looks as if the rest of the family did not convert to LDS. So Harmon Young Lee and William Browder Lee, they migrate out there, out west. The rest of the family predominantly stays here, except for her daughter Rachel, and her this is the census comparison that you might want to look at. There's only 2 children that ever leave this area, and that is Rachel, who goes up to Kentucky with her husband Joseph, and Harmon Young Lee, who goes out west with the Mormon conversion. The rest of the family dies here, is buried here. In fact, of her children, all of her children that died before Mandy dies are buried in the Lee Cemetery, the Richard Lee Cemetery. So we do know that as well. So besides the conversion, William Browder Lee is out there in Utah. Mandy's her grandson, let me make sure I get this right here. Her grandson, through John W. Stewart, he's 7 years old. He goes out with his father, and they're cutting down trees, and the 7-year-old is killed by a falling tree. Tragic story. And then the father is grieving, goes through a lot of issues as far as just sadness, and he kills himself by jumping into a well. And then 2 months later, his wife dies. And she is buried in the Richard Lee Cemetery right next to Mandy's grave. So when you go over there, if you go over to the Richard Lee Cemetery, Mandy's daughter dies, and then that's in 1900, and then Mandy dies on the 12th of June 1900, a couple months after her daughter. And that is her tombstone. I took a picture of it so that in case you guys didn't get to go over there. After after Mandy dies, which is in June, in October, she is proxy baptized and endowed into the LDS faith. And I cannot tell you for sure that William Browder Lee did that. It's either most likely William Browder Lee or Harmon Young Lee, but I don't have access to those records, so I can't tell you one way or the other. But what I can tell you is you don't get proxy baptized into the LDS faith unless you're passed away. So she could not have done it herself because she was baptized in the LDS faith after she was passed away. So it was done by proxy. And then William Browder Lee comes out here, and we have the deed where he sells the 100 acres of land. And in Harmon Young Lee, he also sells his land. In fact, there's a newspaper article in the Herald Citizen where it says Harmon Young Lee is selling out and moving out west. And so that he's moving out west, and then the kids are doing their different things. And so while I don't have a lot of documentation on Mandy, we get a feeling that yes, her life had some trials and tribulations, much like any of the Joseph Roberts children. And I'm sure that the husband leaving her was a blow, but she did have, on a positive note, I will say that at the very end, after she and William Browder Lee have passed away, there's a newspaper clipping that if you have time, you should come over and look at, because it was written on 8 August 1912 into the Herald Citizen. So both William Browder Lee and Mandy are dead. And Harmon Young Lee and his brother John Lewis Lee, the article talks about how they are having a family reunion at their sister's house, and all the sisters that are alive and all the brothers that are alive are having a family reunion after their parents are passed away. So I take a little bit of happiness in that they hopefully work through any feelings they had about their father leaving and going out west, and their brother going to the LDS religion, and they're not believing in that same religion. I take a little bit of happiness in that they were still fellowshipping together. So do you have any questions that I can share about Mandy that comes to your mind? And do I have anyone here that is of Mandy's descendants? Oh, yes. Oh, that's a good point, because the other part that I wanted to show, you guys may have seen this as you came in. So while we have Rachel here as a descendant, this map shows all that I have and that my dad have of Mandy's descendants, where they were born. Okay, so you will see that what's interesting about this map is you of course have the Tennessee group, right? That's the largest clusters, but you'll see other clusters. You'll have the cluster that was in the Texas-Oklahoma area, where we know that they migrated to. We also have the Utah area that they migrated to. And then we have some in New Jersey and in Indiana. And then some, spread out all over. So this is kind of an interesting map. If you wanted to see where Mandy Roberts' descendants were, this kind of shows you that. And then we also have an international map, because Mandy also had descendants that were born in the UK and other areas. And I also have, I didn't mean to, but New Zealand has one of Mandy's children there. New Zealand's out here by Australia. Anyways, Mandy had one child that was born in New Zealand. So with that, I will, I don't know, I know some of you are going to say, well, who are you going to do next year? I don't know, because it's like a year of my life that I focus on this person. And I do it not only to share with you, but I learned so much by going through the material themselves. So let me encourage you to, whoever your ancestors are in the Joseph Roberts line, dig into it and learn about it, because it's really rewarding, I feel like. Any other questions? Anything? Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to our regular announcements.